Welcome to Lecture 8 of Bio 121, Human Evolution and Biology. Last time we looked at the timeline of evolution from an early mammal into humans, and we specifically examined what were the key environmental changes that led to the evolution of hominins during the late Miocene epoch, when all of those rainforests turned into savanna and woodlands. Today we're going to look at the unique dietary and behavioral adaptations that distinguished early hominins from other apes that were alive at the time. These adaptations include big molars and a bipedal style of walking on two legs rather than four. So at the end of the Miocene epoch, around 7 million years ago, the rainfall was seasonal, the habitat was woodlands and savanna grasslands, and the food had changed where fruit was only available part of the year. So we think hominins that were able to survive were eating underground storage organs called oosos. These are tubers. So here I'm showing a chimpanzee eating a tuber, but what he's doing in this photo is something called wodging, which is when you chew on this fibrous plant, you suck all of the nutritional juices out and eventually spit out the pulp. So they're not swallowing the fibrous bits that have little nutritional value, they're just getting the juice. Being able to do this, to chew on oosos, it requires a chewing apparatus, both teeth that are strong enough not to crack if you bit into a raw tuber, and strong muscles that allow you the bite strength necessary to chow down on this type of food. How evolution solved this problem was the production of big molars, and that meant other teeth had to shrink in the mouth to compensate for the oversized molars. So check this out. We have a chimp on the left and an early hominin, an Australopithecus, we could just call her a Lucy, on the right. And what I'm hoping you will see is the relative size difference of the three molars in the back. Notice that on the Lucy, the molars had a bigger biting area on the biting surface of the tooth. The teeth themselves were bigger, both width and depth wise, and so they were able to withstand larger bite forces that would crack a chimp's tooth. So who has bigger molars? I hope you can see that it's Lucy. And then notice the other teeth that aren't the molars. The incisors are the ones in the front teeth. You can also see the pointy canines. All of these non-molar teeth shrank in the Lucy, and we think that is to compensate for the larger area in the mouth that was taken up by molars. There were also simultaneous adaptations in the skeleton that suggest that the earliest hominins were becoming more and more efficient at walking on two legs. So next, let's discuss why bipedal locomotion, walking on two legs, was so important for these early human ancestors. There are many potential advantages of walking on two legs rather than four. And the main one, we think, was the strongest evolutionary force, the strongest natural selective force, was that it improved efficiency of locomotion. So if you are traveling long distances while walking, it takes less energy to traverse a distance if you are walking on two legs, and that's not the case for running. So we really think that bipedal locomotion evolved to allow efficient, energetically efficient walking. How this works is that there's minimal muscles used during the part of the gait where you're just basically picking up a leg and falling forward, allowing gravity to do most of the work. So we see changes in skeletal morphology that suggest different muscles evolved to allow the hips to be stabilized during walking. So that is like these hip stabilizing abductors. But overall, the amount of calories required to walk is less for bipedal locomotors versus quadrupeds. Another adaptation for improved locomotor efficiency on two legs is a lengthening of the legs themselves, which meant that for each step you traveled a little bit further distance. Notice here the relative lengths of a human femur, that's the upper leg bone that connects the knee to the hip. And then we have a Lucy, and for comparison we have a chimp. What you'll notice is that the Lucy and the chimp, the lengths of the femurs are about the same, but the angle at which it attaches to the hip is much different. The angle at which the femur attaches to the hip tells us where the knees are positioned relative to the hip. In the chimp, where the femur is straight up and down, it means that the hips and the knees were equally wide apart, side to side. But here in the Australopithecus, that's a Lucy, and in humans, there is an angle at the femoral head, the part that meets the hip. This suggests that the knees were evolving inward, being positioned directly above the feet, so that the feet were supporting the center of gravity. This supports your body weight when you are standing on one foot. Alternatively, you could say that it stabilizes your stride left to right when only one foot is touching the ground. So in that part of your walking stride, when you're just basically falling forward in a controlled way, it keeps your forward momentum, whereas if you had a anatomy more similar to a chimp, there'd be a lot of side-to-side movement. Another potential evolutionary advantage to bipedalism is that when the creature stands up on two legs, there's less body exposed to direct overhead solar radiation, like sunlight, those damaging UV rays. And there's also more of the body exposed to the wind. So this could be a temperature regulating adaptation. Another potential advantage is that it frees up your hands for other tasks. When you stand up so that you're using just your feet to walk instead of your feet and your hands, you can carry food. Maybe you carry food from where you hunted it or dug it up if it's a tuber back to an area where it's safer to relax and have your meal, or maybe you're carrying it back to dependent children or a mate back at camp. Maybe you can carry dependent offspring or water. And you know I love Darwin quotes. So here Darwin is speculating that man could not have attained his present dominant position in the world without the use of his hands, which are so admirably adapted to the act of obedience to his will. So we're using our hands to benefit us in many ways, and that was only made possible by freeing them up during bipedal locomotion. Another potential advantage of bipedalism is predator avoidance, which these meerkats are practicing. So when you stand up taller, it improves your line of sight over the tall savanna grasses, so maybe you could see predators coming at a further distance, and that would give you and your children more time to get away from that predator. So there are many possible advantages And if you imagine that here is where our ancient ancestors were living, in the African savanna and woodlands, there's a lot of potential dangers. And bipedalism allows them to walk for food while scanning for predators, to carry food back to safety, still while scanning for predators like this lion, minimizing energy expenditure in an environment where it is difficult to get enough food to eat, and minimizing surface area exposed to the sun in this hot climate. So it could be some combination of these factors that led to the evolution of bipedalism in our early hominin ancestors during the late Miocene epoch. In lab this week, you are invited to go to a website where you can virtually examine replica skull fossils from different types of creatures, different early hominins, and you can observe characteristics that suggest whether they were a bipedal or quadrupedal walker. For example, here I'm showing the foramen magnum, which is the dark circle on these skulls. The dark circle represents an actual hole in the bones of the skull, and it's through this hole that your spinal cord connects to your brain. What you will notice on the human, which is the skull all the way to the right, the foramen magnum is more towards the front of the face. Or, I mean, you could think of it if the skull was sitting on top of the spinal cord, it's right smack in the middle of the skull, where you would stick the spinal cord through. That's very different on the dog and the chimpanzee skeleton, where that foramen magnum is towards the back of the head. And that's because when they're moving forward, their eyes have to be looking forward, and for us that would be really uncomfortable. So get on the ground on your knees and hands, and then in order to face the direction of movement forward, you have to crank your neck back because of where your foramen magnum is. So it's very uncomfortable. But your dog doesn't have that discomfort because his spinal cord attaches more towards the back of the head instead of directly underneath. Anyways, you can read more about that in lab for this week and see all of these skeletal signatures of bipedalism. All aspects of the anatomy were affected. You can see signatures of bipedalism in the skull and in the postcranial skeleton, which is everything below the head. So the way our spinal columns curve, the shape of the pelvis, our femurs, remember that's the long bone of the leg connecting hip to knee. The knee structure, the foot structure, the wrist and hand structures, all of these things changed as we became more and more good at bipedal locomotion in our evolutionary family tree. While all of these adaptations made it easier for us to walk on two legs, it introduced a new challenge. Bipedal locomotion changed the shape of the pelvis, which made childbirth more dangerous for women and for babies, such that maternal mortality in humans is high among all primates. And here are some international numbers. Women die in childbirth, about 4 women per 100 live births in the US. That's not the lowest in the world, but it's among the lowest. And then the highest in the world is in Sierra Leone, the country you learned about in a previous lesson. It was my international example of social discrimination and health equity, where 1,360 women die per 100,000 live births. So childbirth remains dangerous worldwide. And our case study this week is called Maternal Mortality. You will examine this thing called the obstetric dilemma. And it results from differences in pelvic anatomy. So here you see the pelvises of a chimp on the left, the transitional pelvis of a bipedal early hominin, in the middle called the Australopithecus africanus, and then Homo sapiens, or a human pelvis, all the way on the right, and that happens to be a male pelvis. What we see on the bipedal pelvis is that its dimensions change considerably. It's shorter from top to bottom. There's a broader, more bowl-like shape to the pelvis. You can see those big, the bony parts, the ilium, are splayed outward. So it's like a bowl containing the internal organs. There's different muscle attachments. In the bipedal apes, like humans, the pubic symphysis, which is where the front parts of the bones come together, it fuses later in life among human women than it does in chimpanzees. So the pubic symphysis in human doesn't fuse until women are in their early 30s, whereas in chimps it's done by the end of adolescence. And that's considered an adaptation to allow extra stretching during labor in younger women that chimps do not require. This pelvic shape, the shape of the hip bones, improves the efficiency of walking. However, it severely limits the size of the birth canal in humans. And here are some comparisons. This is the inferior view, which is the exit of the birth canal. You can see in chimpanzees there's extra space. So chimp females still have difficulty laboring, but it's not as dangerous as bipedal apes. So here we have the Lucy birth canal. And then in the middle, I should explain that this is a fetal skull in the drawings. And then in the humans, it's the tightest fit of all. Quadrupedal primate birth canal is widest front to back, but in hominins, the birth canal is more complicated. Here is the fit between maternal bone structure creating the birth canal, and then the filled-in circle is the shape of the baby's head at birth. And what you can see is that in Homo sapiens, it's the tightest fit of any known primate. One way that humans deal with this tight fit is that unlike other primates who are usually born sunny side up with the baby's face towards mom's front, and other primates, the women just go off in seclusion and give birth by themselves. And if you don't want to see a baboon birth in progress, skip the next slide. Trigger warning, here it comes. This is an actual baboon mother giving birth. And notice where her baby's head is coming out, she can like reach down and grab the head and cradle it up toward her front. Humans, on the other hand, are born facing mom's backside, so that if a human woman were to reach down and grab the baby's head, she would be unnecessarily and unhealthily forcing the baby's head backward. We also know that in humans, secluded births where moms are alone, they have a higher infant mortality rate than with a catcher. And that is because mom cannot reach down and grab in a healthy way the baby as it comes out. I mentioned that the bipedal birth canal is more complicated than in the quadrupedal apes. Imagine the shape of it as a twisted oval tube. So here is an oval tube. Imagine twisting it 90 degrees so that the entrance to the birth canal is at a 90-degree angle to the exit. That means the baby has to enter the birth canal, make a right turn, and then try to come out in a different direction. This is why human labors are long. It takes the baby a long time to orient itself as it's traveling through the birth canal. So the baby's head is widest front to back. Unfortunately, that doesn't match the shape of mom's anatomy, where the canal entrance is widest side to side. So the baby has to enter with its face facing mom's side, and then it has to twist so that usually the back of the head comes out facing mom's front. We have additional adaptations to allow improve safety of birth. If you've ever heard of fontanelles, those are soft spots on newborns' skulls. These squishy bits allow the bones of the baby's skull to contract during birth so that it can take up less space in the birth canal, and then they fuse later after the baby's already been born. Mom's pelvis size determines the upper bound on how big her baby's brain can be at birth. So the brain takes up the entire volume of the skull, and that baby's skull has to fit through the birth canal, or else it and its mother dies. This is another adaptation to bipedalism. More brain growth occurs after birth among humans than it does in our closest living ape relative, the chimpanzee. Chimp brains are over 50% of adult size at birth, but human brains are much less than 50% size of adults at birth. Here's a graph that shows that. It shows that more human brain growth occurs after birth. So here we have a newborn human and an adult human, and it's the height difference between these time points that shows the amount of brain growth that occurs after birth. Compare that in the height difference here of the chimps, and you'll notice much less chimp brain growth occurs after birth. So humans are born relatively dumb, you could say, in that we as humans develop more of our brain after birth than other apes. And again, this is considered a result of the obstetric dilemma, where we have to have babies that can fit through our bipedal birth canals. And just because I love talking about child development, if you didn't already notice that kids learn a lot, data bear this out. Human brains grow most rapidly in the first years of life. So here are the number of synapse formations during early experiences from even before birth. That's the very left side of the graphic. And then the first year of life, you can see language development in blue, sensory pathways like learning to make sense of what you're hearing and what you're seeing, and then higher cognitive functions. That brain development keeps going well into our 20s. So those first years are really important, but we still keep developing our brains later in life than do chimpanzees. I didn't give you a formal definition of obstetric dilemma yet, so here's the formal definition. It's a trade-off. When two evolutionary forces simultaneously act in opposing directions. So for the obstetric dilemma, a narrower pelvis improves walking efficiency because it reduces less side to side, left to right motion during the stride. But a wider pelvis improves survival of childbirth and allows a larger brain at birth. So these evolutionary forces are going in opposite directions. Bipedal walking efficiency keeps the pelvis narrow, but the requirements of childbirth make the pelvis wider. The result of this trade-off is that we have a size and a shape that balances these influences. And it turns out that there's a large sexual dimorphism in pelvic anatomy among humans. Sexual dimorphism is when the male and female typically have different structures, even though they're the same species. So only in women is there a wider pelvis, because only women need the wider pelvis to give birth. So compare that. Here is a male versus a female pelvis. The part shaded in that looks like a funny oval, that's the size of a birth canal. If you want to call that in the male pelvis, I'm not sure, but it's the size of the opening of the pelvis through which, at least in the female pelvis, the baby's head could pass if she's giving birth. And then a telltale sign of a male versus a female pelvis, if you were looking at two specimens, is you look at the angle of the pubic arch. So in the male pelvis, it's much narrower. It's shaped like a V. And in the female pelvis, it's much wider. It's shaped like an upside down U. The female pelvis is also wider from left to right, which you may have noticed differences between male and female body shapes. And it causes differences in the gait. So if you've ever noticed that women kind of sashay when we walk, that is a result of having a different pelvic anatomy. That side-to-side motion is energetically more expensive than if we were walking with less side-to-side motion. More of our energy could be put toward just forward momentum. The human female pelvis is, compared to men's, we have a greater angled pubic arch. That's the thing at the bottom. You can see the female pelvis has an 80 to 85 degree typical angle dimensions there, and the male pelvis is only 50 to 60 degrees of an angle. The female pelvis is more flared with wider hip bones. The female pelvis has a rounder inlet viewed from above, whereas men's is heart-shaped, and that rounder inlet is allowing the baby's head to enter the birth canal. The ischial spines, which are these projecting things that they look, you can see it's pointed out in the male pelvis. It's this little bony protrusion into the birth canal. They're shaped differently in men and women, allowing, again, women to maximize the shape or the size of the birth canal. And women's pelvises are wider. We have a less curved sacrum. That is the part of the lower back that if you were tucking your pelvis under during exercise or dance or something, or for good posture, it's like your tailbone gets tucked under. Your tailbone, if you're a woman, it protrudes into the opening of the pelvis, which I've been calling the birth canal. It protrudes into that space less. So again, all of these female pelvic dimensions are considered adaptations to survive childbirth. The trade-off is that it makes our walking efficiency less efficient. Hence the sashaying from side to side. Here's another way to look at it. This is called the Q angle. You can notice the differences in alignment, particularly at the knee. So the male is on the left, the female is on the right. Due to our wider hip dimensions, women have a wider Q angle where the femur meets the knee. And this causes all sorts of risks of sports injury, unfortunately, in girls and in women. One example of sports injury that women are much more likely than men to suffer is an ACL tear. So this is a tear of a ligament in the knee that is 6 times more frequent in women than in men. So 6 times means women are 600% more likely to get an ACL tear. This is common among both male and female soccer players, basketball players, and other athletes that travel really quickly in one direction, like you're sprinting, and then you twist and turn and go off in a different direction. So this is called cutting. So that twisting motion during the cutting is what can tear an ACL. To avoid this type of injury, people are advised to strengthen knee stabilizing muscles like hamstrings and vastus medialis. And athletes are sometimes coached to learn to cut on 2 feet rather than 1. So when you're changing directions, you plant 2 feet, spreading the weight evenly over 2 feet So you're in effect reducing the torque on the ACL of just that one foot if you tried to cut on a single foot rather than two. Women are also more likely than men to experience patellofemoral syndrome, which is chronic pain behind the kneecap caused by poor tracking or excessive compression of the kneecap against the femur during walking and during exercise. To avoid this injury, you can't do any of the fun exercising. You're advised not to jog, run, or jump, but if you're healthfully exercising, one way to prevent patellofemoral syndrome is to allow healing of inflammation between bouts of exercise. So if you experience pain behind the kneecap, ease off. You can also ice the knee after exercise and take ibuprofen to reduce inflammation. The point is that women are more likely to suffer from this chronic condition than men because of differences in our pelvic anatomy due to the obstetric dilemma. Women are also more likely than men, due to these differences in anatomy, to suffer from plantar fasciitis, which is a foot injury. It causes small micro tears in the ligament that makes up the arch of your foot and connects to your heel. And it's all because we have wider hips and are therefore less stable. We have more side-to-side movement during walking and running. So if you're concerned about that, you could see a podiatrist. They might offer orthotics to help stabilize the foot and ankle. There's also foot stretches that have proven effective against plantar fasciitis. Also, women experience more ankle sprains, twisted ankles, and to avoid that, there are exercises to strengthen stabilizer muscles. Okay, that's all that I have for lecture today. I'm hoping as a metacognition activity, you will take a moment to reflect on your learning journey by jotting down what's the most surprising thing you learned from today's lecture. And number 2, what's your favorite thing that you learned? Thanks for listening. Bye.